Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's Artful Conversation, a Jewish reading of Peter Blume's The Italian Straw Hat. I'll begin today just to keep pace. I know we said we'd start at noon. I do see some people trickling in. Um, I'm Erin Monroe, the Kriebel Curator of American Art here at the Wadsworth and liaison for the museum's Jewish Art and Culture Research Project, which inspired today's insightful look at a noted modern painter with ties to Connecticut and much, much more. Today's Artful Conversation is part of an ongoing series of virtual talks, typically limited to members, but occasionally we open them up live into the public. And in this case, we wanted to highlight this important initiative here at the museum. These talks are made available later and uploaded to the museum's YouTube channel. And we will place links to our channel in the chat, which is a great way to see Rachel's two previous talks relative to this project. Before we begin and I introduce today's speaker, I'm delighted to share exciting news here at the Wadsworth that thanks to a transformational gift from travelers, we are again open on Wednesdays. This is in addition to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, but it gives you another day to visit the galleries and perhaps see the Peter Blume painting you're about to hear about. I do want to thank all the members who have tuned in today for their support and to expressly acknowledge our deep gratitude to the funders of the Jewish Art and Culture Research Project. They include the Zach's Family Foundation, the Cheryl Chase and Stuart Bear Foundation, the Goldfarb Family Fund, and several anonymous funders. Should you wish to donate to this project yourself, there will be a link in the chat to the webpage explaining the project and an opportunity to support further. Now for today's speaker, Rachel Gerstein. Rachel melds her art history training and Jewish background to help present an expansive view of art history and visual culture through the lens of the Jewish experience. Based in New York, she's an independent scholar who's worked both in the nonprofit and private sectors of the art world, including at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, the Hillstead Museum in Farmington, and New York's Richard Feigen Gallery. She trained at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and obtained an MBA with a concentration in nonprofit management from Columbia Business School. Since this project's inception in 2023, Rachel has applied her expertise to help interpret and contextualize objects in the Athenaeum's collections. She is a passionate storyteller and a deeply engaged art historian, and I think you're in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming Rachel.
Thank you, Erin, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our third Artful Conversation to reveal stories about Jewish artists uncovered through the Wadsworth's Jewish Art and Culture Research Project. Today, I'm going to speak about Peter Blume and his painting The Italian Straw Hat, made in 1952. I'll present a Jewish reading of this painting and will share important parts of Blume's biography. Peter Blume was one of many 20th century Jewish artists who had a profound impact on American modernism. By way of background, I'll say a few words about the Wadsworth's Jewish Art and Culture Research Project. This pioneering initiative began in November 2023 with the objective of studying the museum's permanent collection through the lens of the Jewish experience, considering Jews as a religious, ethnic, and cultural minority. What began with a desire to share Jewish stories embedded in the museum's Pizarro painting of his daughter Minette on the left has bloomed into a much broader undertaking to uplift as many Jewish stories as possible, including those of Marc Chagall and Deborah Cass, whose works are also captured on the Wadsworth's landing page for the project, shown here. Today, I will show that the Wadsworth's Peter Blume painting The Italian Straw Hat is a symbolic self-portrait. So you can imagine my excitement upon stumbling across this photograph of the artist seated next to the painting, with what I regard as a wistful look out at the viewer. It's almost as if Blume is beseeching us, please see me, this is my life. This painting depicts Blume's first studio, which later became his bedroom. Just as each of us fills our interiors with beloved objects and memories collected over time, so too the space Blume created for himself and then depicted on canvas reveals a lot about who he was. Blume's paintings, always rich and multi-layered, are filled with many discrete elements coming together to offer a much greater meaning. I'll begin by sharing Blume's biography. Scholarly publications typically refer to Blume as a Russian-born immigrant, which is not the entire story. He was born Pyotr Sorik-Sabel in 1906 to a Jewish family in Smorgon, Russia. In that part of the Russian Empire at the time, there was a sizable leather business, and his father worked as a tanner. His father was also a socialist rebel who participated in the anti-Tsarist Russian Revolution of 1905, for which he ultimately fled to the United States to avoid imprisonment. By 1911, when Peter was 5, he and the rest of the nuclear family came to America and settled in Brooklyn. Here is little Peter in Russia on the left and big Peter in America many years after 1911 on the right. In a formal interview conducted in the 1980s, the adult Blume described that losing Yiddish and Russian as his spoken languages upon immigrating to the United States made his memories of his childhood in Russia hazy at best. He said, "The curious thing about recollections and remembrances is that you have to have a pretty firm language to establish the signposts of memory. Without it, you lose it. Growing up as I did in a bilingual household in the first place, Yiddish was the family language, the kitchen language. Russian was the language of the street in one's contact with people outside the family." Arriving at Ellis Island, which Peter later remembered vividly, the family changed its name to Blume, partly to evade pursuit by the Tsarist regime. Blume described that his father chose the new last name when he arrived. He had wanted Blume, which means flower in German, but he got Blume instead. Like Peter Blume, many immigrant Jewish artists changed their names in America. In America, Blume's father could no longer work as a tanner, so he became a cutter for the garment industry. Blume had other professional aspirations, however. At age 12, he started fixing his mind on one thing, becoming an artist. He explained that this goal created tremendous friction in his family because although his parents were liberal in their mindset, the idea of him starting an ambiguous and uncertain career scared them. They believed that artists always starved. He recognized his parents were trying to make life easier for him, and they wished he would follow the practical path of attending high school and college to pursue a professional career. Nevertheless, beginning at age 13, Blume held a series of odd jobs during the day to fund his art classes at the Educational Alliance, a settlement house on the Lower East Side whose primary purpose was to teach immigrants American manners and customs. As Blume himself explained it, the alliance was meant for the rich Jews already in America to acclimate the more recent immigrants. In these two photos, Blume is shown with classmates at the alliance, where he befriended other Jewish artists, including Chaim Gross and the brothers Moses and Raphael Sawyer. The Sawyer brothers and Gross, whose works are also in the Wadsworth collection, became close mentors and teachers. many of the Jewish artists at the Alliance began their careers by depicting the Jewish world of New York City. But importantly, Blume's early subject matter, at a time when his Jewish friendships were strongest, consisted largely of landscapes and still lifes. In 1925, at the age of 18, Blume spent the summer in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where he first experienced a non-Jewish, far less insular setting. He returned to New York City later that year, and the Daniel Gallery, a progressive venue, took him on. One of the first paintings Blume presented to the gallery was ironically entitled Home for Christmas. The positive reaction Blume received for a non-Jewish subject likely only reinforced his efforts to begin to separate from his Jewish circle in New York. In 1927, however, Blume painted his first canvas to explore Jewish identity when he found himself in rural New England, entirely removed from New York City's Jewish shtetl environment. In Pig's Feet and Vinegar at the Jewish Museum, rendered prominently in the left foreground are the feet of an impure animal according to kosher law, which mandates ritual slaughter under rabbinical supervision and forbids consuming animals with cloven hoofs like pigs. How quizzical, then, that an artist who seemed to reject his Jewish inheritance would now suddenly draw attention to it. The scholar Shira Brisman decodes the window in this painting as separating America, depicted via a typical New England farm scene, from Judaism, with the unkosher pig's feet meant to denote a woman's hands and breasts, a representation of the seduction and temptation of American culture. Brisman posits that the woman in the right foreground, who stands outside staring in at the table, is a surrogate for Blume, who longed to be part of a society from which he was alienated because he was Jewish. Samantha Baskind, an art history professor at Cleveland State University and a leading scholar of Jewish art, posits a slightly different but related theory that the pig's feet represent male sexual organs, alluding to circumcision, the distinguishing mark of the Jewish male and the oldest rite in Judaism. But in the interests of time, I won't dwell further on this point. Suffice it to say that within the setting of New England, Blume questions the Jewish artist's place in the American dream. In 1930, Blume settled in Sherman, Connecticut, the rural town which became his permanent home and which is on full display in the Italian straw hat painting at the Wadsworth. In the 1930s, Blume also traveled extensively in Europe, including in Italy, which inspired his most iconic work, The Eternal City, now at the MoMA. Spending time in Italy brought Blume into direct contact with the country's glorious past, notably classicism and the Renaissance, which we see in the ruins and in the painter's illusionistic sense of perspective and expansive space. Italy also exposed Blume to Mussolini, and in this painting, Blume addresses fascism head-on, denouncing Mussolini, who was a rabid anti-Semite, and is pictured as a green jack-in-the-box on the right. As fascism became ever more entrenched, Blume stood firmly in opposition, establishing himself as a politically engaged artist and embodying the idea that artists should address humanitarian issues. Then in 1938, in response to his artwork, The Eternal City, a postcard was sent to the gallery representing Blume. The postcard's writer associated Jews with communism and spewed the following anti-Semitic diatribe against Blume. "You know that you are a filthy red. A red like you sees Rome red. Everything to you is red because you are a red Jew. What you done is only putting little more fire to burn out your fanatic Jew race." Importantly, Blume wasn't only experiencing anti-Semitic attacks against his art, but was also living in a society that forced him to be cautious about and sometimes conceal his Jewish background. He wrote a letter in 1934 about his experience staying with a family that had commissioned him for a group portrait. "The family is violently anti-Semitic. They obviously have never turned over the possibility in their minds that I may be a Jew, what with my name and all, or I'm sure they would restrain themselves. Maybe things wouldn't be nearly so comfortable if they knew that I was a Jew. The kind of thing that turns my stomach in the course of an otherwise pleasant conversation is the sudden punctuation of Jew. That thrust is hard to bear." After World War II, it seems that Blume's Jewish identity reawakened, and the Holocaust compelled him to revisit his Jewish inheritance in his art. Recollection of the Flood, made in the late 1960s, not only showcases Blume's lifelong fascination with destruction and survival, but also relates these themes directly to the Jewish people. Blume contended that Recollection of the Flood pictured the aftermath of the 1966 flooding of the River Arno in Florence, but Samantha Baskind has pointed out much more. Here we see Blume in his studio as Recollection of the Flood nears completion. And when we look closely at the painting, we observe a busy composition with several figures. 3 restorers in the back actively work to repair a damaged mural, 2 are painting, while the 3rd in a green coat consults plans. 4 tired figures contrast with the restorers' actions. A boy on the right rests against a large bundle with his back to us, drawing special attention to the blue skull cap, a kippah, on his head. The top hat just to his left likely belongs to the man in the green coat. On the left side of the canvas, a family of 3 slumps in complete fatigue. And to that trio's left is a Star of David, made of 2 drafting triangles mounted beneath the sole window, a window we'll see again in the Italian straw hat. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Star of David hexagram had become a symbol of Jewish identity. Baskind thus contends that the painting not only alludes to the Florentine flooding, but also to the Jewish experience, both the famed Noah's Ark story and the Holocaust, with death not by water, but by fire. Baskind believes that Blume's unconscious, which he acknowledged in the creation of this painting, led him to include his Jewish identity. He painted Recollection of the Flood in a post-Holocaust world, changed forever. Before moving on, I want to alert you that the next slide contains a highly disturbing photograph. Baskind argues that the exhausted family in the painting's foreground is a group of Holocaust survivors, and the piles of gourds by their feet represent piles of corpses discovered after the liberation of the concentration camps. Baskind also believes the repetition of X's, especially notable in Blume's preparatory drawing for this painting on the left, reference the all too familiar barbed wire fences of the concentration camps, as shown on the right. It was in the catalog for the Peter Blume retrospective entitled Nature and Metamorphosis in 2014 at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which importantly traveled to the Wadsworth, that Samantha Baskind published these arguments about Blume's Jewish experience and its impact on his work. Her argument is foundational to how I have interpreted the Wadsworth's Blume painting, and her reading of these 2 works, Pig's Feet and Vinegar on the left and Recollection of the Flood on the right, set the stage for my interpretation of the Italian straw hat. I found several other intriguing ideas too, which expanded my interpretation. Thus, humbly following in Baskin's footsteps, if I may, I will build on her Jewish readings of two of Blume's works to present a Jewish biographical reading of the Italian straw hat made in 1952, several years before recollection of the flood. This preparatory sketch offers several important clues. As an aside, one reason Blume was likely not more prolific was that before turning to the final canvas, he spent formative time in the planning stages with many exploratory drawings and rough oils, which he called cartoons. The Italian straw hat is no exception, and the Wadsworth possesses a few of these preparatory works. They were given to the museum by Blume himself in 1956 after the painting had been acquired, because as Blume expressed in a letter to then Wadsworth director Charles Cunningham, they belong with the painting. Please take a careful look at the left-hand side of this sketch. We can make out a hexagram again in the Calder mobile that actually hung in Blume's home. I think it's a Jewish Star of David, just like in Recollection of the Flood. Although the intersecting lines in the finished painting are not quite as clear, it seems highly significant that the Jewish star rendering appears against a yellow curtain. Here I've juxtaposed this part of the painting with the iconic yellow star patch the Nazis forced the Jews to wear. You'll also recall the repetition of X's in Blume's preparatory drawings for Recollection of the Flood, which Baskin showed us reference the barbed wire fences of the concentration camps. Check out the very specific tied string details Blume included in his Calder mobile. To my eye, they are without a doubt invocations of the concentration camps. And let's remember that the Italian straw hat was made in 1952, whereas Recollection of the Flood was made in the late 1960s, which means the Jewish imagery in the Wadsworth's painting would have come first, and importantly, would have been even more proximal to World War II. What is especially noteworthy about the inclusion of a Jewish star and references to the Holocaust in the Italian straw hat is that if the Wadsworth's painting is Blume's symbolic self-portrait, albeit missing a figural representation of Blume himself, then in his autobiographical work, Blume called attention to his Jewish heritage. The room depicted here was initially Blume's studio in Sherman, Connecticut, but after he built the black and white striped studio in 1948, which we see a sliver of in the middle of the painting, this room became his bedroom. Blume's dear friend Malcolm Cowley, who lived across the street from him on Church Road in Sherman, wrote of the Italian straw hat, "All the images you glimpse through windows or screen doors exist or existed then, but you could not see them through the actual windows and doors of that empty room." Just like all of us, Blume created a space for himself that reflects many things about who he was. Blume himself explained this enigmatic work. I was trying to clarify my approach to picture composition by, as it were, nailing down the relationships of extremely familiar objects and their peculiarities. There is no better place to study this problem than in one's own bedroom. It's at once the world within and the world without, and I tried to convey a sense of being inside of a house with the world around it. Thus, in this painting, Blume captures and depicts his place in the world. Let's now capture the painting in our mind's eye as we move from left to right. I read the Italian straw hat as a triptych inspired by the Northern Renaissance masters, like the Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes pictured here, which we know Blume saw during his visits to Italy. It is commonly understood that the second commandment in Judaism prohibits figural representations in art, and accordingly, Blume's triptych could be read as a Jewish one with its exclusion of people. It's also noteworthy that Blume's painting invokes straw, the very material on which baby Jesus lies in the central panel of the Portinari altarpiece. In this detail on the left, we see not only how Blume was invoking the purple flowers in the Portinari altarpiece, but also how his meticulous technique drew from the Flemish and Italian masters, including his use of egg tempera and very fine brushwork. Notably, there are flowers both in the beginning of Blume's triptych on the left and in the end on the right. Could it be that, according to my autobiographical reading, Blume was invoking his father's selection of the new last name Blume when he arrived in America? You'll recall that Blume said his father had wanted Blume, which means flower in German, but instead got Blume. It is also intriguing to think about how Blume so often perched a jar of paintbrushes on the windowsill of his studio, and whether the flower bouquet perched in the very same spot in the Italian straw hat might have been Blume's way of signing his painting. In effect, the artist Blume was here. Might the replacement of these brushes with flowers be a tongue-in-cheek biographical reference and pun to the artist who blooms? Through the window on the far left of the Italian straw hat, a herd of cows grazes on the grass. As you'll remember, Blume's father was a tanner in Russia, so might this detail have been Blume's way of beginning his life story? This oil sketch of the composition helps us home in on the skeleton of the work. We see clearly how Blume used the primary colors red, blue, and yellow as composite parts to make a whole, in this case a life. We also see here how well Blume knew the history of perspective. When he traveled to Italy, he studied Renaissance frescoes, where he was struck by how interior and exterior space seemed to be part of the same viewing plane. He was clearly attracted to pictorial devices that could showcase his mastery of virtual space. We also see across the triptych the arc of a literary narrative, and we know that in addition to being a keen observer of the old masters, Blume was an avid reader. In an interview in 1983, toward the end of his life, when asked if reading had had any effect on his painting, he initially answered that it was just an accumulation. It's interesting to think of ideas and influences accumulating, and to consider how the Wadsworth's painting can be read like a literary work with chapters and a series of movements, a narrative in effect. Blume himself discussed how his art was conceptual. He drew from experiences in many different places and times and mixed them into a painting to seem like one contiguous whole. We have already established that the left side of the work begins Blume's life, invoking Russia, his Jewish inheritance, and flowers for a play on his name. When he made this painting in 1952, he was 46 years old, midway through his life. Note the slope of the ceiling. It starts in the upper left corner of the canvas at the highest point, and a straight line from this corner point takes us down 2/3 of the way across the canvas to mark the beginning of the third and final part of Blume's life, yet to unfold. Might the small gray square at the very top of this part of the ceiling denote some sort of ascendancy to the heavens? Blume signed the painting just to its right, leaving his named traces behind. Note too how the door and window on the left are closed. This part of Blume's life is over and done with, whereas the middle door is open to daylight as it represents the here and now. The door on the right is also closed, as this final and third chapter of Blume's life has not yet happened. Intriguingly, the window is open here, though. Also, in progressing from left to right, we saw on the left a landscape teeming with life and cows outside the closed window, a field with a heap of straw positioned at its crest in the middle vista, and the open window on the right, outside of which is a cemetery. The drawers of the blue bureau may contain stored memories. Note as well the light switch in the middle position, neither on nor off, smack in the middle of the canvas and Blume's life story. And just down from the imaginary line separating the second from the third chapter of the triptych or narrative is a thermometer with its mercury level positioned at the 2/3 point. I also draw your attention to two important Connecticut-related aspects of the painting. First, the Calder mobile we homed in on earlier in the barbed wire discussion. Blume befriended fellow art student Alexander Calder during his early days in New York City, and when he eventually settled in Connecticut in 1930, Blume was part of an active group of avant-garde artists that included Calder. The Blumes owned two Calder mobiles, one of which figures prominently in the Italian straw hat. An interesting detail is the perforated top of an Old Dutch cleanser can, which Calder painted black, and which is a hallmark of the mobile Blume hung in his studio, then bedroom. The chair at the painting's very center also has Connecticut symbolism. It is a Hitchcock chair, which was a staple of early American interiors of the 1940s and 50s, manufactured beginning in 1819 in a factory on the upper Farmington River. In the photograph here, Blume relaxes with his fellow artist friends, and a Hitchcock chair is easily spotted on the far right. Calder is on the far left in the buffalo plaid shirt, with Blume just to his left. Of course, straw is an essential element of the painting, even in its very name, the Italian straw hat. In this preparatory drawing for the painting, Blume focuses entirely on the straw basket atop the Hitchcock chair at the nexus of the composition. I also find the positioning of the knitting needles and their color red to be highly significant, and possibly a reference to the Nazi swastika we can see in works by Blume from the 1940s and early 1950s, where he repeatedly used red slashes to invoke the Nazi symbol. As Baskind has shown, in Bowie on the left, deep red lines are incised into the growths attached to the buoy, and in the shrine on the right, etched red lines scar Jesus' emaciated body, marking him as the epitome of Jewish suffering. Living through the revelations of what had happened to the Jewish people in Europe during the Holocaust would have undoubtedly marked Blume for life. Understanding the possible significance of knitting in this painting became a veritable obsession of mine during my research, and I couldn't have been more excited when I landed on a 1961 published interview in which Blume spoke about the women beneath the tree knitting in Tasso's Oak, another one of his most famous paintings, made a few years after the Italian straw hat. Blume said, "The women beneath the tree are knitting, adding one stitch to another in the mechanical process which forms the fabric of life." In the Italian straw hat, then, the idea of knitting a life, the life of Peter Blume, is the focal point at the precise center of the painting. The Italian straw hat is replete with symbols and hidden meanings, and the last point I'd like to raise today is the influence of another Northern Renaissance master on Blume's technique and subject matter, namely one of my personal favorites, Jan van Eyck. just like how Van Eyck in the famous Arnolfini wedding portrait shows off his technique and his ability to render textures, the dog, the fur coat, so too does Blume in the Italian straw hat, with details like the rug strands and the undulating coral. In 1952, the very same year the Italian straw hat was painted, Blume gave a lecture for a conference at the MoMA called Modern Artists on Artists of the Past, and he wrote the following about Van Eyck. This is the epitome of realism, more real than the visible world. It is a complete world contained within a frame, the processes so concealed as to make illusion and reality one. Blume had no interest whatsoever in making abstract art like his Connecticut cronies. He instead was rooted in hyper-illusionism, just like Van Eyck. In paintings by both artists, one can glimpse painstakingly executed elements of the surrounding city and/or countryside through the windows of a minutely detailed room. Van Eyck's paintings typically had religious purposes, of course, and it is interesting to consider how Blume turned his mundane bedroom into a sacred space. Another curious connection between the Arnolfini wedding portrait and the Italian straw hat is the emphasis on hats. Here I've juxtaposed Blume's straw hat with Van Eyck's distinctive and memorable top hat. For a little levity, here are 4 amazing photographs of Blume from the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, in all of which he is wearing a hat. I was hoping to find him in the very same straw hat as in the Wadsworth's painting, but had to settle for these. Returning to the more serious topic of Van Eyck references influencing Blume, in the Arnolfini wedding portrait, there is a mirror capturing the artist's reflection. There is also a mirror in the Italian straw hat, but it does not show Blume's reflection. Rather, it is blank, save for a glimmer of light, and seems to reflect back Blume's life with its position on the far right of the narrative. The mirror on the far right, in a preparatory sketch for the Italian straw hat shown here, seems to allude a little bit more closely to the artist's head and actual likeness. And just above the mirror in the Arnolfini wedding portrait, Van Eyck includes the Latin phrase communicating Jan van Eyck was here. Now let's behold the last detail I'd like to share with you today, Blume's own version of Jan van Eyck was here. When I stood in front of the Italian straw hat in person, I couldn't believe my eyes. The artist Blume himself appears in the reflection on the doorknobs, both on the left and on the right of the painting. Blume stands with outstretched arms and possibly an easel in hand. Given all that Blume experienced in his life, it seems especially poignant that he was making this point. Peter Blume was here. He survived. The Jewish people survived, and life goes on. Perhaps the rug at the painting's center, literally and metaphorically, represents the unstable ground Blume found himself on as a Jewish immigrant to America. Against the undulating rug, the American Connecticut Hitchcock chair is firm and provides a stable platform for his life. And if the red knitting needles on the chair at the painting's precise center are possibly a visual reference to the Nazi swastika, the knitting itself then, stitch by stitch, is a metaphor for the life Blume built afterward. The Italian straw hat is testament then to Blume's own survival and remembrance, and to the Jewish people's survival and remembrance. One of the central objectives of the Wadsworth's Jewish Art and Culture Research Project is underscoring the influence of Jewish artists on the development of modernism in the United States. Indeed, modernist artists like Peter Blume were responding to the changing political landscape of their day. I'll end with a moving excerpt from a lecture Blume gave in 1948 at a post-World War II conference addressing the artist's responsibility as a citizen. Photographs of the concentration camps were first published in the spring of 1945, and in the wake of revelations about the mass killing of Jews during World War II, Blume wrote, "There are some, the disenchanted among us, who are preaching the gospel of despair. They tell us that there is nothing before us but the long black night of the Dark Ages. However, the millions who have suffered in this war and have survived refute this firmly. They are determined to make the world a better place to live in, and they will have their way." Thank you so much for joining us today, and in the time that remains, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rachel. That was such an incredible deep dive. And for me, who's looked at this painting for years, I just really appreciate the insights. And you're getting lots of praise in the chat. Well researched, well presented, brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, truly, it's also, I think, so important to the project, the way you land on Blume, alluding to his own survival and perseverance, and being able to have a contribution to this conversation so many years later. I will open it up to questions. Please, you can put them in the chat. I'll be moderating them. I can see there's actually a few docents on who are saying so many wonderful things I'd not seen before in the painting. Thank you so much. Very enlightening. I'll kick it off and say, you found a couple wonderful lectures that Blume gave. Were there many of them? How did you sort of sift through really a fair amount of archival information that it's been so enlightening?
Yes, so certainly, of course, secondary literature was a port of call, but I was much more interested in accessing primary sources and him speaking about his work. Through a wonderful colleague in our network, Stephanie Stebich, I was able to get a transcript of this interview, this famous interview in the 1980s in which he participated. And that was where I got this, the information at the very beginning about what Yiddish and Russian had meant in his life, and how that affected his memory, losing those languages. So as much as possible, I wanted to come to his primary documentation, his own voice, and assess that for what it was. But for sure, Samantha Baskin's reading and the monograph about the 2014 exhibition was incredibly helpful.
Yeah. And what do we know of his life, his family life once he was here? Did he marry and have kids? And do we know much about his wife? Was she an immigrant?
No, she was not. She was not Jewish. That would be a whole other thing one could explore. He didn't have kids, which is also, interesting and hard to obviously draw too many conclusions from.
Certainly. Yeah. Amazing. Well, I think the primary source material is so valuable, and thank goodness it exists, and that he had as good of a memory as he did, because I think that's also, even those visions of coming to Ellis Island, that must have been so amazing as a little boy. I'm not seeing any immediate comments. Let's see. Excuse me, questions. So much praise. It's really wonderful. I wish you could see this. Fascinating history. Thank you so very much. The blue chest is so bright and prominent. Was it an actual piece? Is there any thought you've given about that?
So the blue chest is one of many details. I was saying to Erin right before we began today that even the coral, when I looked last night as I was prepping, I looked at the detail of that, and I had a reading of it that was too late to research and put in. The blue chest, what I know is that it it was not blue. That was an actual chest and it wasn't blue. And as I tried to show, I think that the use of color is also really striking in the
Yeah,
work and really
certainly.
reminiscent of that painting by Van Eyck that I put next to it,
Mhm.
on that one slide. So I think, there is this idea that the drawers, as I say in the presentation, are stored memories. But
Mm.
I don't know. I don't know more about that. There are so many things that you can tease out of this painting. It's so many layers.
Yeah, there's
Um,
one on that note. Jenny McComas has asked, in looking at the fringes of the rug, do you think they might be an allusion to a talus?
that's fascinating. I
That
love that.
also kind of fascinating. There was someone that says the chest looks like a Hitchcock chest in my own bedroom.
Ah,
A question to share the last quote of Bloom. Is that
yes.
yeah, and maybe we can share that at the end while I queue up one other question. There was a question about how the museum came to own this painting, which I'm happy to answer. We purchased the work in 1955 from the gallery Durlacher Brothers, and we actually have correspondence between the then director and Peter Blume about the painting. And he was a known entity here. So my hope is that we were, acquiring work that was of the moment in the 1950s, and Bloom fit the bill. So that I can answer that. It's been here since 1955, which is great. And then he later gave the preparatory studies. Do you want to mention that quote, Rachel?
Sure, just to read it again?
Sure.
Or,
Yeah.
okay. There are some, the disenchanted among us, who are preaching the gospel of despair. They tell us that there is nothing before us but the long black night of the Dark Ages. However, the millions who have suffered in this war and have survived refute this firmly. They are determined to make the world a better place to live in, and they will have their way.
It is timeless. That is a great description. And speaking of timelessness, a question about Bloom's politics. Did he have any run-ins with anti-communism after the war? Do we know anything of his political views?
I think we can infer, that certainly the bit the flack he got for his portrayal of Mussolini in the Internal City, that diatribe that I quote from, and I just had an excerpt of it. It goes on even longer, um, but no, I mean, I can't speak any more specifically.
Yeah.
Than to
That's
say that he was, certainly humanitarian and anti-fascist and
yeah. And just one follow-up regarding his reception during his lifetime. The question was, how was he appreciated? And I can say too that in addition to hosting the more recent monographic show that the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts organized, we hosted a Bloom retrospective in the 1960s. And, we had already acquired the painting at that time, and he went on to live another 30 years. But our connection to him goes back several decades, which I find very interesting. And I'm not quite sure, the specifics of how we came to have that traveling show. But it was a reason why the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts approached us more recently, sort of rekindling and revisiting that appreciation. And the Connecticut tie-in, as we've seen, is just perhaps one reason why he's an artist worthy of introducing as a important modernist painter. Just looking in the chat. Oh, yes. And the reference to the rug possibly being an allusion to the talus is the fringe and the stripes. So that's a very good point. Any other comments, questions? We do have a little more time. Just to remind you, at the top of the chat were links to the webpage for this project, the museum's YouTube page. If you enjoyed this and you don't already follow us on social media to keep an eye on what's coming up at the Wadsworth, I would encourage you to do so. There's Rachel's contact information, research at thewadsworth.org. And if there's no further comments, I would say thank you again, Rachel. This has been so meaningful and for all the good work that you're doing. And one more comment. Oh, wow. This is great. So given that he painted the Italian straw hat in the midway point of his life and he was giving close attention to old masters and poets, do you think the painting could also reference Dante's Divine Comedy and putting himself in the role of the pilgrim? This may also relate to Tasso's Oak as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
I think that tracks. I know Bloom went to Italy at least twice, so that's also having a very strong interest in Italian literature and art.
Sure.
Question about the mobile. Did the wire on Calder's art look the way Bloom painted it? Do you want to answer this, Rachel?
Well, Erin, do you want to tell the story of how we
Okay, so we're very fortunate at the Wadsworth that we have Calder mobiles, and we have one early work from the 30s on view that has tied string like that. And we went and we consulted it just a few weeks ago. And by no means are those wire knots or threaded knots as prominent as they are. In fact, I think Calder was so mindful about the aesthetics of his work that they would have been intentionally much more subtle. So at least in the piece that we looked at, they were not at all that prominent. So that suggests a kind of embellishment, as it were, to mimic that barbed wire. Question, is there an appropriate tour for children age 11? Well, I would say short answer, our public tours can be adapted for all ages. So if there was something specific to a younger audience, we do have our second Saturdays for families, but docents that lead the tours can certainly adapt them for those that are attending. Also, was this recorded? Yes, this, if anyone was late to this has been recorded, and give us a little time to process the file, and then it will be available on the museum's YouTube page, and you can watch it anytime. And probably one final question, how many paintings did Bloom create?
It's not as few as Vermeer, that's for sure, who was also in my mind, but it's not that many. I think it's under 40 for sure.
I think he was very meticulous and deliberate, and that pace was a little bit slow.
Exactly, and all of the preparatory work that occurred first. I mean, he
Yep.
is represented in, like, there's one at the Art Institute of Chicago, one at the Met, one at the Mo, but not deeply, because I think in part because he's just not as well known, and
Mhm,
because he didn't make that many.
mhm, mhm. And some of the way the art history books have categorized him is as describing him as a magic realist, which is not necessarily a formal school by any means, but there is this sense that, yes, he was painting in a very representational style. But as Rachel pointed out, he didn't go the route of something more abstract where you can't, discern anything recognizable. But there is an element of sort of mystery and a surreality to his work that often makes him a little bit hard to categorize. And I think that's also a true asset to him, really abiding by his own aesthetic. All right. Well, thank you once again, everyone. I think we will leave it at that, and more appreciation coming through the chat. And just, yeah, keep in touch, everyone, and we hope to see you again. Bye bye.